Sir, with all due respect, this isn't a museum tour. You need to step back. The words came from Corporal Marcus Diaz, 24 years old, built like he'd spent every morning of his life in a base gym, still wearing the expression of a man who had never once been wrong about anything. He was standing in front of a seized M48 Patton tank engine block in Maintenance Bay 14 at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and he was covered in hydraulic fluid and frustration. Behind him, two other Marines, Lance Corporal Webb and Private First Class Torres, stood next to a heavy-duty hydraulic floor jack and two sets of chains that had, collectively, done absolutely nothing. The old man standing in the bay entrance didn't move. He was 79 years old, 5 feet 10, slightly stooped at the shoulder the way men get when they've spent decades leaning over things. He wore a faded green canvas jacket over a blue chambray shirt, work boots with crepe soles that had been resoled at least twice, and a plain dark ball cap with no logo on it. His hands, resting at his sides, were enormous, wide-palmed, thick-knuckled, the kind of hands that have been used hard and often for most of a human lifetime. There was a faint scar along the outside of his right forearm that disappeared into his sleeve. He looked at the engine block for a long moment. Then he looked at Corporal Diaz. Then he looked back at the engine. He did not speak. He did not step back. He just stood there watching, the way a man watches when he already knows what the problem is and is simply deciding whether to say so. What those three young Marines didn't know, and what nobody in that bay had thought to find out, was that the man they'd just told to step back had spent 3 years working on that exact engine under conditions that would have ended most careers in the first week. They would find out. It would take a wrench, 2 bolts, and a story that 4 decades of peace had nearly buried entirely. If you believe that real experience is worth more than any certification, type veteran in the comments right now. Because what Roy Calloway did in that maintenance bay, and what it cost him to know how to do it, is a story I don't want you to miss a single word of. His full name was Roy Eugene Calloway. He was born in Beaufort County, North Carolina. In the spring of 1947, the second of 5 children raised in a wood frame house on a dirt road, where the nearest gas station was 6 miles away, and everyone fixed their own everything. His father had been a sharecropper, then a shade tree mechanic, and then, when Roy was 12, the man who kept half the county's farm equipment running out of a shed behind their house. Roy had learned to read an engine the way other children learn to read books, by doing it every day, in failing light, with someone patient enough to let him make his own mistakes. He had graduated high school in June of 1965, turned 18 that August, and received his draft notice that November. He reported to Fort Jackson, South Carolina in February of 1966, and by that fall, he was stationed with the 1st Ordnance Battalion, 1st Logistical Command, operating out of Long Binh, Vietnam. The Army would have made him infantry. He'd tested well enough, and they always needed riflemen. But a master sergeant at the MEPS station in Raleigh had looked at Roy's mechanical aptitude scores in the 99th percentile, and quietly redirected his paperwork. Roy never met that man again. He thought about him often, for 3 years, from late 1966 through his discharge in March of 1969. Roy Calloway was a motor pool sergeant responsible for the maintenance and battlefield recovery of M48 Patton tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers in some of the most hostile terrain the Vietnam War produced. He was, in the technical language of the Army Ordnance Corps, a track vehicle repairman. In the practical language of the men who needed their vehicles running or they would die, he was the person you called when nothing else worked. He came home in the spring of 1969 with a duffel bag, a discharge certificate, and the particular quietness that men bring back from places where they have been asked to perform the impossible on a schedule that allowed no failures. He married a woman named Carol Ann Pickett from New Bern in 1971. He opened a small engine shop on Highway 17 south of Jacksonville in 1974 and ran it for 39 years before his knees forced a partial retirement. Carol Ann had passed from ovarian cancer in 2019 after 48 years of marriage, and Roy had been living alone in the same house they'd bought together in 1975 ever since, keeping the garden she'd planted, driving the same pickup truck he'd owned for 11 years, and visiting his grandson, Lance Corporal Devin Calloway, on base when the boy's schedule allowed. It was Devin's promotion ceremony that had brought Roy to Camp Lejeune that Tuesday in October. The ceremony had finished at 1100 hours. Devin had been pulled into administrative processing afterward and told his grandfather it might take a couple of hours. Roy, who had nothing to do and nowhere particular to be, had asked a staff sergeant whether there was anywhere on base he might walk around. The staff sergeant had said sure, stay clear of the restricted areas, and gestured vaguely toward the vehicle maintenance complex. Roy had walked slowly toward the sound of machinery, the E. Maintenance Bay 14 at Camp Lejeune's Consolidated Maintenance Facility was not, on most days, a place that generated much drama. It was a large, high-ceilinged, corrugated steel building that smelled of motor oil and brake fluid, and the particular metallic warmth of machines that had been worked on for years. A row of fluorescent shop lights hung overhead, buzzing faintly, casting flat white light over the clean concrete floor. Along the walls, pegboards held organized rows of wrenches, sockets, and torque drivers. A rolling tool chest sat open near the far wall. The floor was clean except for a spreading patch of hydraulic fluid near the center, where the M48 engine block sat on a wooden pallet, waiting. The engine was a Continental AV1790, a 12-cylinder air-cooled twin-turbo that had powered the M48 Patton tank series from the early 1950s through the Vietnam War era. This particular block was part of a restoration project. A vintage M48A3 the base's Historical Preservation Committee had been working on for 2 years, donated by a veterans organization in Gastonia, intended eventually for display outside the base's Heritage Museum. The engine had been removed for overhaul, cleaned, catalogued, and then partially seized when an improper storage procedure had allowed moisture to cause corrosion binding between the block and the mounting flange assembly. It needed to be separated from its cradle before reassembly could begin. Corporal Marcus Diaz was the lead on the job. He was a competent marine mechanic, certified on modern wheeled and tracked vehicles, trained on hydraulic recovery systems, proud of his record and not shy about it. He was the kind of young man who had the respect of his peers because he worked harder than most of them and was faster than all of them, and who had learned, perhaps without fully realizing it, to mistake speed for wisdom. He had been at this problem for 4 hours. He had tried the hydraulic jack 3 times, tried a chain puller twice, and had twice requested larger lifting equipment from the motor pool's senior staff sergeant. Both times he'd been told to figure it out. When Roy appeared in the bay entrance, Diaz's reaction was reflexive. An old man in a canvas jacket with no base credentials visible, wandering into a working maintenance facility. He told him to step back. He used the phrase museum tour because the engine on the floor was old enough that it seemed like the relevant comparison. He did not know, yet, that the man he was talking to had forgotten more about that engine than Marcus Diaz had ever been taught. Roy did not step back. He walked forward, slowly, deliberately, until he was about 4 feet from the engine block. He crouched down, not easily, not without visible effort from his knees, but completely, getting himself level with the mounting flange where the hydraulic jack had been attacking the problem from below. He looked at the block for perhaps 30 seconds without touching it. Then he stood back up with the same careful effort and put his hands in his jacket pockets. "Your binding's not where you think it is," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. Diaz blinked. "Excuse me? You've been trying to push it off the cradle from the bottom, but your seizure's lateral." Roy nodded toward the right side of the assembly. Two mounting bolts on the starboard side, third and fifth from the aft flange. They weren't torqued evenly when the block went into storage. Moisture got in under uneven clamping pressure. You've got a corrosion bond on the right side. The left side's been free this whole time. That's why your jack isn't doing anything. You're pushing against the free side. Diaz stared at him for a moment, then looked at Webb. Webb looked at Torres. Torres had put his phone away. "With all respect, sir," Diaz said, and the "sir" was not respectful. It was the kind of word you use to put distance between yourself and a problem. "This is a Continental AV1790 out of an M48A3. We have technical documentation. We've followed procedure." "I know what it is," Roy said. Something in the way he said it made Diaz pause. Not the tone. Roy had no anger in it. It was the absence of everything that tone usually contains when an older man says something like that. No defensiveness, no desire to be believed. Just the flat, quiet statement of a man who does not need to argue about something that is simply true. Diaz looked at the engine again. He looked at his chains. He looked at the hydraulic jack. Then he looked at the old man in the canvas jacket and the risoled boots, and he made the choice that tired young men sometimes make when they are stuck and someone older offers them an exit they didn't ask for. "Look," he said, "I appreciate you stopping by, but we've been trained on this equipment, and we've been at this for 4 hours. I think we've got it handled." Roy nodded, once. He did not leave. He walked to the tool chest near the bay wall and looked at the organized rows of sockets and wrenches with the patient attention of a man in a library who already knows the call number of the book he needs. To understand what Roy Calloway knew about a Continental AV1790 that Marcus Diaz did not, you have to go back to January of 1968 and a place called the Khe San Plateau, the northwestern corner of South Vietnam, 11 miles from the Laotian border, 6 miles south of the demilitarized zone. Roy was 20 years old. The siege of Khe San began on January 21, 1968, when North Vietnamese Army forces began a sustained bombardment of the U.S. Marine base there. For 77 days, the position was under nearly constant artillery and mortar fire. The NVA had surrounded it with an estimated 20,000 troops. The Marines held. The holding cost them. Roy was not stationed at Khe San itself. His unit operated in support of the broader Ordnance Corps area along and near Route 9, the main east-west road through that part of the country. But on the night of February 7, 1968, a disabled M48A Patton from a Marine unit supporting operations along that road was recovered to his forward position after taking an RPG strike that had partially destroyed its left track and jammed its engine mounting assembly. The tank carried 3 crew members. 2 had been evacuated by medevac. The third, the tank commander, First Lieutenant Gerald Marsh from Lexington, Kentucky, was trapped in the commander's hatch by a jammed mechanical linkage that had seized as a result of the blast. The ground around them was not safe. The FOB was under intermittent mortar fire. They had roughly 20 minutes of darkness remaining before the area would be visible from enemy positions on the high ground. Roy had gone in with a toolkit and a red-filtered flashlight. The situation with that engine mount was, in certain specific technical respects, almost exactly what was sitting on the pallet in Maintenance Bay 14. An RPG strike at that angle torques the engine cradle asymmetrically, which puts uneven clamping pressure on the mount bolts, which, combined with the heat of the strike, creates a lateral corrosion bond almost identical to what years of damp storage had created in the museum piece. Roy had not had a hydraulic jack that night. He'd had a 3/4-inch drive torque wrench, a breaker bar, and a very specific understanding of where load concentrates in an asymmetric mount failure. He'd learned it 18 months earlier in a shed in Long Bin from a 53-year-old master sergeant named Earl Timmons, who had drawn it out in chalk on a board on a Tuesday afternoon when Roy had been 19 years old and certain that nothing the old man was drawing could ever matter to him. He had removed 2 bolts from the 3rd and 5th mounting positions on the starboard side of the assembly, not to loosen the engine, to release the binding point. In an asymmetrically seized mounting flange, removing those 2 specific fasteners changes the load path. The stress locked into the lateral corrosion bond redistributes across the remaining mount points. The assembly moves, not because of force applied, but because of force released. The way a frozen drawer moves when you stop pulling from the front and instead tap the side. Roy had freed Lieutenant Marsh in 11 minutes. They had gotten off that ground 90 seconds before the next mortar salvo came in. Gerald Marsh had finished his tour, come home, attended law school on the GI Bill, and become a circuit court judge in Lexington, Kentucky. He and Roy had exchanged Christmas cards for 53 consecutive years. Roy still had every one of them in a shoebox on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. He had never told his grandson about that night. He had never mentioned it to the Marines who ran the restoration committee he'd quietly helped with 3 times over the years. He did not generally mention it to anyone. There were things you kept and things you told, and Roy had always known which category that night belonged to. Back in the bay, Corporal Diaz was setting up the jack for a 4th attempt. He'd moved the contact point slightly based on a suggestion from Webb and was walking Torres through chain positioning. The air in the maintenance bay had that particular texture of people repeating a failed action because they don't have a better idea but cannot yet admit it. Roy had found what he was looking for in the tool chest: a 3/4-inch drive socket set, a torque wrench, and a breaker bar. He carried them over to the engine block and set them down on the floor next to the assembly without announcing the action. Diaz noticed. "Hey." He straightened up. "Those are our tools." "I know," Roy said. "You can't just... This is a working maintenance bay. You're not authorized to..." "I'm going to show you the 3rd and 5th starboard mount bolts," Roy said. He was already crouching next to the engine block, not touching anything yet. "I'm not going to touch them. I'm just going to show you." He pointed with one thick finger. 3rd bolt. 5th bolt. Both of them subtly different from the surrounding fasteners. The thread exposure at the flange interface was not uniform. A faint brownish stain traced the bolt bore on each, running in a direction inconsistent with the other mount points. Diaz stared at the bolts. He looked at Webb. Webb said quietly, "That is actually different." "The corrosion bond is inside the bore on both of those," Roy said. "Your jack is applying vertical force to a lateral bond. You will never move it that way. You need to relieve the clamping load at those 2 points, and the block will come off the cradle without any jacking at all." Diaz stood very still for a moment. "If I'm wrong," Roy said, "you've lost nothing but 10 minutes. The bolts come back out the same way they went in. There was a long pause in the bay. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere outside, a vehicle started up and moved away. "If you're right," Diaz said slowly. "How do you know that?" Roy picked up the torque wrench. "I'll tell you while I work," he said. "Subscribe to the Old Guard and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happens when Roy puts that wrench on those bolts is the part of this story that nobody who was there that day ever forgot." Roy worked without asking for help. He did not work fast. Speed, he had learned in a forward operating base under mortar fire in February of 1968, was what you used when you didn't know what you were doing. When you knew what you were doing, you worked at exactly the right pace, which was usually slower than everyone watching was comfortable with. He positioned the 3/4-inch socket on the third starboard mount bolt and applied left-hand pressure on the breaker bar. Not impact force, just steady, deliberate rotational load. He held it for a moment, reading the resistance, the way a doctor holds a wrist to feel a pulse. "Vietnam-era Continentals," he said, without looking up. "They were built to be repaired in the field. The Continental Aviation Design Team knew that. They built stress relief into the mounting geometry. 4 points carry primary structural load. 2 points are what I'd call compensatory. Third and fifth starboard. They were meant to be adjusted in field conditions. That design principle never made it into the standard overhaul documentation after the Army rotated out the M48s. The manuals got updated. The field knowledge didn't." He increased the torque on the breaker bar. The bolt moved. It was not dramatic. There was no bang, no sudden release of tension. The bolt simply turned, smoothly, correctly. The way a bolt turns when the force being applied is exactly right for the work being done. Roy backed it out 4 full turns, not removing it, just relieving the clamping load. He moved to the 5th position. Lance Corporal Webb had stopped pretending to do anything else. He was watching Roy's hands. "You were in Vietnam?" Webb asked. 66 to 69, Roy said. He was reading the 5th bolt the same way he'd read the 3rd. "Ordnance Corps. Motor Pool Sergeant, 1st Log Command." "On these engines?" "M48s and M113. Mostly M48s in the later years." The 5th bolt moved. Roy straightened up with the effort that his knees required. He stepped back from the assembly and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Diaz. "You want to try moving it now?" he said. It was not a question. Diaz walked to the engine block. He looked at the 2 backed-off bolts. He looked at the flange. Then, almost involuntarily, he reached out with both hands and applied lateral pressure to the block. A simple push, the kind you'd give a car that needed to be moved a few feet. The block shifted. Not far. 3 inches, maybe 4, but it moved, freely, easily, on its cradle, without the jack, without the chains, without any of the equipment that had spent 4 hours failing to accomplish exactly this. The bay went very quiet. Torres said from behind them, "What?" Webb made a sound that was not quite a word. Diaz stood with his hands on the engine block and looked at Roy Calloway and said nothing for several seconds. Roy crouched back down and began walking the block off the cradle by hand. Alternating corner pressure, the old rocker method, moving it in small, deliberate increments until it was fully separated from the mount. His hands worked with the specific sureness of a man performing a task he has performed so many times that it has become something between memory and instinct. "You said you'd tell me while you worked," Diaz said. His voice was different now, quieter. February of 1968, Roy said, somewhere along Route 9. And he told them. He told them about the M48 that came in on a recovery vehicle at 2200 hours with an RPG hole in its left track housing and an engine mount that had torqued under the blast. He told them about the temperature, 42 degrees Fahrenheit. He still remembered it exactly. Cold fog coming off the Vietnamese hills. A smell in the air that you learned to read in I Corps the way farmers read weather. He told them about Lieutenant Marsh in the commander's hatch, not wounded badly, not panicking, just unable to move. The linkage holding the hatch mechanism completely jammed by the torque from the blast. He told them about finding the torque wrench and the breaker bar in his kit. About crouching next to the mount assembly in the dark with a red-filtered flashlight, while the FOB's perimeter reported contact to the northwest. He told them about the third bolt and the fifth, about the way the load path changed when you relieved those 2 points, about the way the linkage freed up, not with a bang, but with a sound like a long, slow exhale. The sound metal makes when it is finally allowed to do what it was designed to do. He finished walking the block off the cradle and stood up. 11 minutes, he said. We were off that ground 90 seconds before the next salvo. Marsh went home, became a judge up in Kentucky. A slight pause. We still talk. The block sat, fully separated, on the pallet. Diaz had not moved. He was still standing where he'd been when the block first shifted, and his expression had changed in a way that was hard to name precisely. Not embarrassed, though there was some of that. Something older. The look of a young man encountering for the first time something that has existed his entire life without his knowing it. How did you know they'd be the same positions? He finally said. Same bolts? Same engine, Roy said. Same design. Different story. Same problem. He set the torque wrench on the tool chest with a small, precise click. The machine doesn't care how many years it's been. He had been in the bay for just under 40 minutes when the door opened. Master Gunnery Sergeant William Ochoa was 51 years old, had been in the Marine Corps for 29 years, and was currently the senior maintenance advisor to the base's Historical Vehicle Preservation Committee. He was a large man with a shaved head and the physical bearing of someone who had once been larger and had remained exactly as dense. He had come to check on the restoration project after getting a report from the motor pool office that the crew was still wrestling with the engine mount. He walked into the bay. He saw the separated engine block on the pallet. He saw the 3 young Marines standing very still. He saw the old man in the canvas jacket replacing a socket into the tool chest. He stopped. He looked at the engine block. He looked at the old man. Roy Calloway, he said. Roy turned around. Billy Ochoa, he said. Ochoa had been a 22-year-old lance corporal at Camp Lejeune in 2001 when a retired Ordnance Corps veteran had come through to consult on a vehicle restoration project. The first time Roy had returned to the base he'd trained near 4 decades before. Ochoa had spent 3 afternoons watching the old man work. He had written, in a notebook he still kept, 6 pages of field repair techniques that no existing manual documented. He crossed the bay in 5 strides. He shook Roy's hand with both of his. What did he do? Ochoa asked, looking at the engine, then at Diaz. Diaz told him. 3rd and 5th starboard mount bolts. Load path. Backed off 4 turns. Block walked off by hand. Ochoa looked at Roy. Roy shrugged slightly. Same problem I had in 68? Ochoa looked at Diaz. Do you know who this man is? Diaz said nothing. Ochoa reached into his jacket pocket and produced his phone. He had a photograph pulled up, a scanned image from a military record, faded black and white, A younger man in army fatigues crouching next to the mounting flange of an M48 engine in a forward operating area. Vietnamese jungle in the background. The particular gray light of early morning or late evening in the tropics. The man in the photograph had Roy Calloway's hands. Silver Star, Ochoa said. March of 1968. Citation reads, exposed himself to enemy fire to recover a disabled vehicle and free a trapped crew member using hand tools alone in 11 minutes under intermittent mortar attack. He looked at the 3 young Marines. None of them were moving. He has been coming to this base to help with restoration projects for 20 years. He has never once mentioned that citation. Not once. He looked at Roy. I found it in the committee archives 6 months ago, Ochoa said. I've been meaning to call you. Roy said, you didn't need to. I know, Ochoa said. I wanted to. Corporal Diaz walked outside with Roy about 20 minutes later, after the block had been stabilized and the project notes updated. He stood in the October afternoon light outside the bay door and said the thing that young men say when they have been wrong in a way they cannot minimize or deflect. I'm sorry, he said. For earlier. For how I spoke to you. Roy looked at him for a moment. You had a problem you'd been fighting for 4 hours, Roy said. You didn't need a stranger walking in and telling you what you were doing wrong. That's not an excuse for how I talked to you, sir. Roy was quiet. Then he said, you want to know what the real lesson from that night on Route 9 was? Diaz waited. I didn't know those were the same bolts because I'd read a manual. I knew because a master sergeant named Earl Timmons had spent an afternoon in Long Bin showing me exactly where load paths concentrate in an asymmetrically torqued mount assembly, using chalk marks on a board in a shed. He was 53 years old. I was 18. Roy put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the parking lot. I thought he was wasting my time. He let that sit. He was handing me a tool I didn't know I'd need yet, Roy said, in a place I hadn't gone to, for a night that hadn't happened to me. That's what the old guys are for. He looked at Diaz steadily. Not the ceremony. Not the museum. The tool. Diaz nodded slowly. The way someone nods when they know they won't fully understand something for years, but they know they won't forget it either. Roy's grandson Devin found him outside the maintenance complex at 2:30, a little over an hour after the ceremony. Devin looked, around the eyes and in the set of his shoulders, like a younger version of the man he was walking toward. He had his grandfather's hands. What have you been doing? Devin asked, looking at the faint engine oil on Roy's jacket cuff. Helping out, Roy said. Devin looked at him. Devin had grown up in the house on Highway 17. He knew what helping out meant when his grandfather said it. Grandpa, he said. Roy smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that doesn't need much face to carry. You ready? I told your mother I'd call by 2. They walked to the parking lot together, the old man and the young Marine, in the quiet that people share when they don't need to fill the air. In Maintenance Bay, 14 behind them, Corporal Diaz was updating the project log. He wrote down the technique in full detail. 3rd and 5th starboard mount bolts, load path redistribution, lateral bond release, 4-turn relief on each. He added, in the notes field method, not in current overhaul documentation. Source: Sergeant Roy Calloway, retired, Army Ordnance Corps, 1st Log Command, Vietnam 1966 to 1969, Silver Star, March 1968. Recommend for inclusion in Restoration Manual. He then looked up the citation in the base archives and read it 3 times. The citation described, in the careful official language of military commendation, 11 minutes on a hillside in northern Vietnam. A 20-year-old motor pool sergeant with a flashlight and a torque wrench, working under fire, in the dark, in the cold. It noted at the end that when asked about the action afterward, the sergeant had said only this: "The machine just needed someone to listen to it." There are men like Roy Calloway in every county in this country. They live on quiet roads in houses they've owned for 50 years. They drive old trucks and keep gardens their late wives planted, and they don't need you to know who they are. They are not standing at the edge of your maintenance bay hoping for recognition. They are not waiting to be discovered. They are just there, available if you'll stop long enough to notice. The question is not whether they have something to give you. They do. The only question is whether you're going to keep your floor jack pointed at the wrong side of the problem, or whether you're going to stop and listen to someone who solved it 58 years ago with 2 bolts and a piece of chalk on a board in a shed. Roy Calloway learned it at 18 from a 53-year-old man he thought was wasting his time. He passed it to a 24-year-old Marine who will be passing it to someone else, in some bay or field or hillside, in some year that hasn't happened yet. That's what the old guys are for. Subscribe to the old guard. We have more men like Roy, and their stories deserve to be heard before time takes them from us. Hit the bell. These stories don't go viral on their own. The best tool you'll ever have isn't in a chest or a catalog. It's the man in the canvas jacket standing quietly at the door. If you'll just ask him in.